Welcome back, and now as we continue on with our videos for Chapter 6, we're going to take a look at the hymn to Hermes. I'm also going to pause a little bit at the end to mention something about the Ares-Aphrodite story that comes right before the hymn to Hermes. But I'm going to focus right now on the hymn to Hermes. The theme that we have here is the dysfunctionality of the Olympic family, which reflects the frequent dysfunctionality of human families, and how, despite all that, the Olympians can still function as a group and remain in power over the human world. That's not always necessarily a good thing. However, it does show that despite the seemingly earth-shaking occurrences that happen in these two works of literature, in reality, these are just little blips that go on in the Olympic family, and once they've passed by, life just goes on in the Olympic family. Whereas these, of course, would have had much more serious ramifications, probably among mortals. Okay, so I'd like you to pause your video for Hermes, and please turn to page 209 in your Harris-Platzner textbook. Please pause your video and turn to the Hymn of Hermes in your Harris-Platzner textbook on page 209. Okay, are you there? Excellent. So the hymn to Hermes is one of these illegitimate births of Hermes, and you'll notice how Hermes has to be stowed away in a cave with his mother Maya, because there's always the possibility of Hermes being beset by trouble from Hera, the stepmother. And remember that in a separate story about Hercules that you'll see in the later chapter about heroes, Hercules is also another illegitimate son of Zeus from a woman named Alcmene, and Hera really does actually try to kill Hercules, but he survives because the two poisonous snakes that enter his cradle, which he's trying to kill, he's able to grab hold of by the neck and strangle, and thereby is able to survive the onslaught from Hera. Now, in the case of Hermes, he doesn't actually end up suffering that type of attack from Hera directly, but he does have a bit of difficulty because of his own personality. We discover at the beginning of the hymn to Hermes that he's a trickster. So he, therefore, reflects the same trickster tradition that we see with Prometheus back in Hesiod's works of days, and again the Norse god Loki that we mentioned at that time as well. All right, so Hermes is full grown when he's in his mother's cradle, the same way that Athena is full grown when she bursts out of Zeus's head from the axe of Hephaestus. So as a full grown god, the first thing he does is to go outside of the cave and slaughter a tortoise. And then he, from that, produces the lyre. Interestingly, the Greek the Greek word for a tortoise, which is chelys, C-H-E-L-Y-S, is also the word for the tortoise shell that can be used to make objects in the Greek world, including the frame of the lyre. Okay, so he slaughters the tortoise and turns it into the lyre, with which of course he's able to make beautiful music immediately because he's a god, and he goes running out of the cave with his lyre. And the first thing he decides to do is to steal a bunch of sheep that belonged to his half-brother Apollo. And he's so clever about it that he turns the sheep to walk in the wrong direction. And when an old man sees this and wonders what in the world is going on, Hermes tells him, "Don't say anything." Now, the old man actually does end up in another version of this myth, ends up actually saying something, and he gets afterwards turned to stone by Hermes, who goes back and punishes him. So Hermes can be a punitive god every once in a while. But in this version, we just simply see the reference to the old man, who does actually pass on word to Apollo what went on with Hermes. All right, so Hermes drags off the sheep, and then he slaughters a couple of them, but he does not consume any of the meat. This is another version of the tradition described to us also with the story of Prometheus and the two piles of meat for Zeus, of why it is that the gods will only savor the smell, the odor from the sacrifice, but will not actually touch any of the meat. So Hermes slaughters the cattle, but does not touch any of the meat. And we have therefore a ritual myth or charter myth explanation for why an animal sacrifice is burned whole and then is completely consumed by the Greeks. They do not need to leave any of the meat at all for the divinities. So, not surprisingly, Apollo is furious about this, discovering that his cattle have been stolen. So he runs all over the place trying to find out where the cattle is. And eventually, Hermes, after he's committed this act of atrocity on the sheep, goes running home and slips back into his cradle. And along comes Apollo, wondering what's going on with Hermes. And Hermes, from his bed, tells a bunch of kitty lies, like, me, I'm just interested in my mother's milk, blah, blah, blah. Well, Apollo just grabs Hermes and drags him up to Mount Olympus. And when he gets him in front of Zeus, Zeus hears the same thing. All I want is just my mother's milk. And it's very obvious that he's lying. And Zeus bursts out laughing at it, actually. And even Apollo probably has to smile a little bit. And then Zeus tells Hermes, okay, come on now. You got to stop this joking around and tell Apollo where the cattle are. So Hermes does bring Apollo to the cattle, but then Apollo gets really angry when he realizes that Hermes has slaughtered a couple of them. He's actually about to kill Hermes, but when he tries to shackle him, you'll see this also with Dionysus in chapter 8, when he tries to put bounds on him in order to kill him, the shackles fall right off. You can't bound gods in any way. And then Hermes starts to play the lyre. And it's at that point that when Apollo is deeply charmed with Hermes, as in fact everybody has to be, such a cute little kid as this, and a really endearing trickster type. All right, so Apollo then makes up with Hermes. They become, in fact, best of friends as well as close brothers. In exchange for the dead sheep, Hermes ends up giving Apollo the lyre, and that is how Apollo is explained as having the lyre as his attribute, and how he becomes the god of music and the arts. And in exchange for that, Apollo gives Hermes the caduceus, the famous rod with the snakes, and for that reason, Hermes has some connection with medicine, although that still remains primarily Apollo's prerogative. But also Hermes uses that rod, travels around him for certain types of magic acts that he might have to carry out every once in a while. Because Hermes is so quick-witted and quick in motion also, he is now welcomed into Mount Olympus, and he now becomes the messenger god from Zeus down to humans, as well as the purveyor of souls from the above world down into the netherworld. You remember that it was Hermes who had to go down to locate Persephone and bring her back up from the above world, and it was his ability to do that got him established in that role. Hermes also is the god of travelers, anybody who's trying to carry from one place to another. He can offer them protection. And interestingly, of course, because thieves need protection too, Hermes is the god of thieves. You might wonder, thieves? Why would thieves get protection? Well, thieves, if you know in Dungeons and Dragons that there is a class called Rogue, which specializes in stealing. Stealing can be very useful. For instance, in warfare, in the Trojan War, there was a point at which the Greeks had to sneak into the city of Troy to steal a wooden statue of Athena. They were told by an oracle they needed to do that if they were ever going to have any chance to sack the city of Troy. So stealing comes in handy in certain places. And the famous saying about the Spartans that we get from Xenophon's Constitution of the Lacedaemonians is that the Spartans taught all their boys to steal, and if the boys got punished for theft, it was because not that they had been stealing, but that they got caught doing it. So it turns out that thievery has its place in the ancient Greek world, a very reluctant one, and Hermes is the one in charge of that, since he was, of course, the original consummate thief. All right, so Hermes thereby, again, becomes a well-established Olympian. We'll see later in like manner how Dionysus gets the same as well. Despite having these seemingly negative qualities, they actually still form part of Greek civilization. They have to be accepted as part of human nature, and that's how we reflect that with Hermes. So his acts do nothing at all to disturb the Olympic order, nor does this story, the one I'll conclude this video with. This is on the pages in Harris-Platzner right before the hymn. This is taken from Homer's Odyssey, and it's a song that is sung while Odysseus is at Phaeacia, describing his adventures, all his wanderings to the king and queen of Phaeacia. There's a banquet that goes on, and a bard named Demodocus sings the story of Ares and Aphrodite. The story here is that Aphrodite, who did not like the marriage that had been arranged for her with Hephaestus, the limp metallurgy god, instead takes up with Ares. Hephaestus is really put out about this. So because he's the god of craftsmanship, he devises a real nice scheme. Ares and Aphrodite wait one day until Hephaestus is away out traveling, they think, and they immediately get into bed together, only to get trapped in it with nets and chains that fall down on them so that they can't move. And then all the Olympians come around, and some of them laugh hysterically. That's Apollo and Hermes. The goddesses do not come over, however, to look at this, and Poseidon is quite upset about this treatment of Ares. So, in the end, Poseidon manages to persuade the really angry Hephaestus to let go of Ares, and finally he does. But Hephaestus is pretty upset about the fact that the Olympic family doesn't really respect the cuckolding that he's undergone from Aphrodite. So Ares escapes, and so does Aphrodite. She goes off with her nymph someplace in embarrassment to be taken care of. So the idea about this affair going on with Ares and Aphrodite is to show once again that the Olympic gods really are beyond humans, not only in their physical capacity. This is something that might be important for you to discuss in your final exam about the superhumanity of Greek gods and heroes. Not only do they surpass humans physically, the fact that they do not die, the fact that they're much more powerful than humans, but also morality, including even family ethics, do not seem to affect the Greek gods either. There are quite a few violations of human conventions, such as incest, that happen with this Olympic family. And even here, an affair, essentially adultery, that would be a cause for death and even murder in the case of both the Greek and the Roman worlds. Here, just eventually just gets laughed at as a source of embarrassment for both Ares and Aphrodite, but ultimately nothing more. Nobody really feels that much sympathy for Hephaestus that he suffers this. I mean, he is, after all, a disabled figure, but disability doesn't get any real brownie points back then. And so that's all it seems to be. The gods are beyond humans in many ways. The idea is that the humans, for whatever faults the gods have, need to still worship the gods consummately, because the gods are all powerful. And most human affairs are seen as within the power of gods to turn for good or for ill. So although these stories are told about them, although they're often amusing and sometimes a bit scary and their ramifications as to the way the gods might behave, nonetheless, that does not make the gods in the minds of the Greeks any less worthy of worship. The humans are no less needful to worship the gods for their own self-preservation. Okay. That takes care of Chapter 6, so read it with care. Make sure that you know the Hymn of Hermes potentially as a passage for your midterm or your final. And we'll be turning in our next videos in this series to Chapters 7 and 8 on Apollo and Dionysus. So we'll see you next video.